Hey YouTube, CSM10495 here, and we're going to be reviewing for the AP Government exam. This time we're going to talk about Chapter 2, the Constitution. Let's kick it off right here. The problem of liberty. There was a little bit of a problem that I don't really believe the Americans really thought about at the time, but it definitely comes into effect later. Let's first start with what they thought. This is really the colonial mind. The colonists. Whoops. The colonists believe that the British were corrupt. And they were hoping, they wanted them not to become corrupted. They figured with their freedom, they would not be as corrupt as the British. That could be argued today if we're corrupt or not, but we'll get into that at some other point. They believed in a natural law. Let's talk a little bit about this. It's natural law, or laws that can't or should not be taken away by a government. And they were life, or the right to life, the right to liberty, and prosperity. So you have the right to live, you have the right to freedom, and you have the right to prosper, the right to go at your own will, to do better and whatnot. So really, the Revolutionary War was a war over ideology. Which is kind of contrary to the idea that we went to war to avoid taxes. It's really not economics. It comes down to the thought that we should rule ourselves. Really, that was the main push towards war. Furthermore, let's talk a little bit. So that's the Revolutionary War. Let's talk a little bit about what they like to call the real revolution. The real revolution is a change in thought that, or let's call it a change in belief as to what makes government legit. We went over legitimacy in the other video. It's really that they have the right to lead in this case. So they have government by consent, not by force. And they say that they therefore want a constitution to be able to say what government should be able to do. And hopefully that would somewhat define what it can't do. If it's not written, they shouldn't be able to do it. So, of course, the big problem we'll get to a little bit more is, of course, liberty is more important than government. So, freedom should be given. Government cannot take that away, is really what they're getting at. They also really wanted the legislative branch to be more superior than the executive. So we'll just... So we'll say superior. Now, they have, the first thing that they do once we're free, we have the Articles of Confederation. We become a confederate nation. Almost a confederacy, but not to be confused with Civil War, of course. So, the problem with that, they had some type of constitution. They call it the Articles of Confederation. So, Articles of Confederation. Now let's go over some of the problems with it, with the articles. What made it hard for the nation to run. They can't levy taxes. So how's the government supposed to get money? The government was almost running off loans and personal payments by the people, but it was optional in that sense. Taxes you did not have to pay because they couldn't force you. There was no central commerce or currency, let's say. Each state had its own money, which made it kind of hard to make business between. Each state had one vote in Congress, so we could say equal representation was kind of a problem because some states had more people than others, so they felt left out if they had the same amount of power in government as a state of less. So yeah. Anyway, you would need, this is almost impossible. You would need 9 of 13 reps to vote one way in Congress, or their type of Congress, in order to get stuff done or to get legislation passed. And that was very hard to do. That's above majority. There was also, since there wasn't much federal money, there was no real federal army. It was really just state militias, or maybe no national army, whatever you want to word it, and no federal judicial system. So there was nothing to really enforce, or basically enforce laws. So okay, let's go to the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention was a meeting of several political minds to see what they could do to fix the Articles of Confederation. Now, first they looked at different state constitutions, to try to frame our soon-to-be national constitution. They looked at Pennsylvania's constitution and Massachusetts' constitution. Pennsylvania was too strong and even too democratic to really work because people really didn't know what they were voting for, very direct, which doesn't work out too well because not everyone knows what they're voting for, so almost representation's better. However, Massachusetts was too weak and less democratic, so we needed to find a balance between the two for our country, and that's what the Constitutional Convention was for. I'm just gonna mention Shays' Rebellion. You don't really need to know much about it. You just really need to know that it was a rebellion that really made the states come together more. Made them hurry the process of creating a constitution because they were worried that the country would collapse unless they had the new constitution written. So let's talk a little bit about the framers. The framers were regular people. They had somewhat practical affairs. They, for the most part, wanted to write a brand new constitution. So therefore abolish the Articles of Confederation. Which makes sense. It was really messed up. It'd be very hard to amend all of these things. It'd just be easier to throw it out and start over. They were influenced by John Locke, which was a democratic person in Europe. And they had a big problem that they called the delicate problem. It's a very delicate thing. So let's just write it out a little bit. A delicate problem. And the delicate problem really is, it comes straight down to, we need a strong government, the people would believe in. But at the same time, we want to make sure that there's freedom. We don't want that government to be able to take away freedoms. So we need So we figured that there also needed to be constitutional limits to yeah, limits to guarantee or make sure that there was no tyranny. They didn't want a king to all of a sudden pop out. They wanted to make sure that the government was safe, wouldn't be taken over, and at the same time they wanted to make sure that it was free. The country would remain free. So there were two major plans that came into effect, or not even came into effect, that were brought up. The first one is the Virginia plan over here in the challenge. Virginia plan, and let's go over the quick basics of it, which had a two-house legislature, an executive branch chosen by legislature, okay, and there would be some type of council of revision with a veto power, so a separate council to veto, and it was key that that the legislature would be supreme, and more importantly, one house would be elected by the people. The other would be by state legislatures. Therefore, giving light to our indirect democracy. Let's talk about the New Jersey plan very quick. The New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan wasn't as popular off the back because it really wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation instead of making a new constitution, which of course made everything harder to do. Okay. So finally, we get a compromise. The compromise, big compromise. The compromise would be we would have House of Representatives. The House of Representatives would be based off population, and we would also have the Senate, which would be based off, or not based off, every state would get 2 senators. Therefore, every state would have the same amount. So overall, the states with more people would still have more power. However, the Senate having 2 members per state would therefore reconcile interests of both the big and the small states. Anyway, let's move on to our next section here, the Constitution and Democracy. Now, as is kind of obvious at this point, the founders did not want a direct democracy. They also sometimes call this a pure democracy because not everyone knows everything about politics. Furthermore, it was really hard to get word across the country at the time. There was no instant communication, no internet, no phones. So it would be very difficult for everyone in the country to know everything about politics and be able to vote often. So, therefore, we needed this system of representation, which we would wind up getting. So, therefore, we need representation, which is met by the compromise. So that works out very well. So, therefore, popular rule wasn't as much of an element of the new government. At the time, where is my pointer? There we go. So at the time, the state legislature, this is not true anymore, would pick senators and the people would vote in the House reps. Okay. So, they also had an amendment process. Of course, later we would get judicial review to give the Supreme Court some type of actual power to better checks and balances. They have separation of powers. Let's talk for a second here about federalism. Just really quick. Federalism, or Federalists, want strong national government. They also want it to be supreme or sovereign. Okay. Furthermore, we get 3 different types of powers as a result of this split up we'll eventually have between state and national government. The first one is enumerated power. Second one is reserved power. The third one is concurrent power. Let's quickly define all of these. Enumerated powers are those given to the federal or national government. Federal gov. Reserved powers are given by the Constitution to the state governments. So state gov. And concurrent powers are those shared by both. However, remember the federal government is supreme sovereign over state government, so federal can't overturn state rules. Shared between state and federal. Good. Let's talk about the Constitution and liberty. Alright. Now, this really comes back to the delicate problem whether or not the constitutional government would be able to respect personal liberties. And, so, let's skip that part for a little bit. Let's talk about the Anti-Federalists for a little bit. The Anti-Federalists they said that liberty can only occur in small republics. Which, of course, was not what we were looking for. We were looking for a large country in the United States, or at the time only 13 states, but which would eventually expand to become much larger. And at the same time, we wanted that national government to, of course, control. So they said that in big republics, or in big, this is still the Anti-Federalists, it said, big republics, national government becomes very distant from the people, which really isn't what they want. They want the government to listen to the people. So distant from people. And of course, they say a strong national government would use its power to annihilate state functions, which is True. That of course is possible because the state government is not sovereign. The national government is. So they also therefore want, in order to prevent that from occurring, they also want restrictions placed on government, on the federal government. So Madison, which is who is a Federalist, Madison says that liberty is safest. Which is he is a Federalist, so Madison liberty is safest in large republics because the government has the power there to protect, has the unity to protect even, which is quite the contrary to what the Anti-Federalists were saying. So, and a large republic would result in more moderate views because more people are around, more radical people on either side of any argument would therefore center it more and leave it moderate, so people would not lose their rights or gain too many, and this would prevent further problems. So he also said something really important here. I want you to kind of think about it a little. Government, and this is still argued about today, should be insulated from passion. Now this is because they don't want the government to be acting because of one person's. It really goes down to religion a lot. They don't want the government to act off one's religious views. They want the government to act off views that many believe will help the country become a better place or safer, all of that. So, yeah, they have to be pretty insulated because otherwise, the government comes down to religion too much, and anyway, they the Anti-Federalists want a Bill of Rights, to protect them from the government. So they want a Bill of Rights in order to protect rights, make sure that the government doesn't overstep its boundaries at any time. Madison responds by really saying that most states already have it, so why should we add it? Finally, he's overturned, and they decide to add the Bill of Rights to limit the federal government to specific powers. And finally, as a result of the Bill of Rights, we will get ratification by the states to put the Constitution in power. Okay. So, now let's just talk about slavery really, really quick. Slavery is barely mentioned in the Constitution. It's inferred that the founders thought slavery would die out over time, so they figured, let's not mention it. It's too big of a thing for us to talk about right now. We're a new country. We don't have this. And they were worried it would lead to a civil war. Well, we had a civil war anyway later. Of course, you all know. So it's virtually unmentioned. They do talk about how the Declaration signers were Hippocratic in that they wanted it to be gone, but they didn't mention it. But anyway, finally that'll lead to the Civil War. Let's just say it's virtually unmentioned. Now, of course, they could have said no slavery then, but that may have led to more dilemmas, so they didn't. They knew that the new country wouldn't be able to handle a civil war at that point. Alright, anyway, let's talk about the motives of the framers. The economics really wasn't their biggest motive. Economics played a second row seat. So it was really second most important. Whether or not one would be able to have money that they could spend on all sides of the country, wealth, what the government would do with money. Most important was liberties. Of course, it always goes back to liberty. We did not want another king. We didn't want a government that could take away our rights. So we get a Bill of Rights. All right, liberty is most important. Easy. Um. Huh. Let's say. Let's see. It really. The framers. The biggest argument that they had with each other was really. Whether or not how to make a government that was strong but wouldn't take away the rights of the people. We already have that, so let's just move down a little to constitutional reform in the modern years. Um, some people think the government is, it's really a question over is the gov too weak or too strong? There's really no right answer. Some people say it's too strong with all the new things they're doing to limit speech and limit other rights, and some people say it's too weak in that they're not doing enough to limit, people shouldn't be able to say stupid things, and, well, it could go either way. It's very common now to note that, Gov is exposed to interference. I'll explain in a second. This really comes down to that there's like things like bribery and stuff like that where people really aren't trying to do what's best for the country. They're trying to do what's best for themselves. So, and that results in distrust by the people. A big thing that has come up a couple times that I just want to talk about within constitutional reform is the idea of a line item veto. This comes up on APs every once in a while. So, line item veto is the idea that the president can cross out or get rid of certain parts of a bill and make the rest law. This was passed by George Bush, and it was not George Bush. It was passed by Clinton, and it was overturned, called unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It was proposed again, still hasn't been caught, still hasn't been allowed to pass and stay. Really, the question comes down to, now today, the new question really is, in everything, who is right? And that really goes down to liberal versus conservative on every single issue. And in the end, there's a lot of settling that has to occur, which usually leads to a lack of new amendments. We've very rarely amended the Constitution. It has to be a big thing in order to be an amendment. So it must be a big thing. If it's not a big enough thing, it won't make the amendment. State officials know not to waste their chance at amendment. Because they know if they bring up something for amendment, it's going to go around the country, and if there's the slightest bit chance it's not going to pass, they're likely not going to bring it to the government. It's just not worth it. It's not worth the worry. So, constitutional amendments, they rarely happen. So, that's really all for the second chapter of the AP Government textbook, the Constitution, CSM 10495. See you in the next video. Bye bye.